We still have a few minutes before 5, so we'll give some folks some more time to join.
How are you doing, RJ?
Oh, the usual complaints, but other than that, how about you?
I'm okay. How is life at the Steelworkers?
Getting ready for our convention coming up in a couple of months.
Oh
Very
my.
well. This is our second one without you now, I think.
Yeah, it's great. Go ahead, have them.
Hey, you can always come visit if you like.
That's okay. We got some more people.
Yeah, looks like good turnout tonight.
Hmm. Hi, Chris. Hi, Zach.
Hey, everybody. Um, we usually try to keep these to an hour, so I'll give it another minute, but we will try to get started on time so that we don't take up more than an hour or so. I know with three panelists, it's gonna that's gonna be tight. So if we go a little bit over, those of you who need to can certainly drop off. The video will be shared, with the Collegian staff and then also in our newsletter so that folks who weren't able to make it tonight can see um, what we talked about. But um, I do want to get started as close to on time as possible for that reason that we do try to only keep them to an hour or so. So I see that we have Dustin and we have um, do we have Gina or Giana? I'm sorry, and Jenny. Are they here? Let's see.
Here.
Giana's here
I'm
and
here too.
Jenny's here too. Okay, great. Okay, and I see a couple more people popping in. So why don't we get started with some introductions, and we'll just go in alphabetical order, starting with Dustin.
All right. Hey, everybody. Corman, Jenny, good to see you guys. First off. Graduated, I was going to say Collegian as if I went there because that's really, still feel like that's the actual school I went to. But was at Penn State 2004. Corman and I were together for all 4 years. Jenny was there for the last two of those. Covered football in '02, I think it was '02 season, with the Larry Johnson 2,000 yard thing. I think they went to the Citrus Bowl that year. Ended up being, I think I was sports editor, I think I think spring of '04, after Corman was. Since then, basically went covered James Madison basketball at the Harrisonburg Daily News Record in Virginia. Did that for 5 years. Followed Chris to Bloomington, Indiana, at the Bloomington Herald-Times. Covered IU basketball, football, baseball, and some other stuff. From '09 to '14, covered Tennessee football at the Knoxville News Sentinel, from '14 to '16. Went to DK Pittsburgh Sports for a year. I don't recommend that. Covered the Steelers and the Pirates there. And then came back to Indiana, worked a couple years at The Athletic, covering IU, Purdue, and Butler. And that was among the layoffs in June of 2020 during the pandemic. Went back to the Herald-Times, covered Indiana again, and now I'm the beat writer for covering the Indiana Pacers at the Indianapolis Star. So I don't know if there's anything else I should cover in there, but grew up in Pittsburgh, or half hour east of Pittsburgh, basically. So, Pennsylvania guy. Penn State was kind of an obvious choice for me, and just, Went straight to the Collegian, started working there like I think the first, I mean, I brought clips there like the first week of class, and so basically lived there the entire 4 years I was there. So I don't know if there's anything else we need to cover there, but that about does it for me.
What part of Western PA did you grow up, Dustin?
So Norwin High School, so Westmoreland County.
Okay, my wife teaches at Norwin High School to this day.
Is that right?
Yeah, she's right downstairs. I don't know if you would have been there at the same time. Her name in those days would have been Angela Mazer.
Angela Mazer.
Taught
Doesn't
English.
taught English? Okay. All right. I
Yeah.
feel like I know the name. So did she teach in the high school?
In those days, she might have been in the middle school, but she's in the high school now. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. All right. I feel like I
Yeah.
know the name. I don't think I ever had her. So, but that's really cool. That's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Gianna, you want to go next?
Yeah, hi. I am from Baltimore area. I currently am the Baltimore Ravens reporter for the Baltimore Banner, with my editor being Chris Corman, another collegian grad. I graduated in 2019, so I guess I worked at Collegian mostly all 4 years, and I covered the only year that Penn State football has upset Ohio State. And then I also covered Penn State basketball and most importantly, Penn State men's volleyball, my favorite beat of all time. And I also interned for the Reading Eagle while I was there. From there, interned for the Baltimore Sun. Um, Went and covered Auburn football, had the pleasure of getting out right before Penn State played Auburn and smack them twice in a row, so I could be biased for it. Covered the Flyers for the Philadelphia Inquirer before coming here. Um, yeah, that's kind of it's a little bit shorter than Dustin's, but that's it in a nutshell. I'm only a few years removed from you guys though, so spent a lot of time in the old Collegian building before it got knocked down.
All right. Thank you. And Jenny.
Hey everybody, I'm Jenny Vrentas. I'm a State College native. My dad taught at Penn State. He was a chemical engineering professor. And then I went to Penn State. I joined the Collegian in the spring of 2003, the spring of my freshman year. Covered women's volleyball, women's basketball, football team, and later was an editor. Graduated in '06, and I went to the Star Ledger in New Jersey for about 6 years. Went to Sports Illustrated for almost 8 years, and I'm currently at the New York Times. I joined the sports desk. They bought The Athletic on my fourth day and disbanded the sports desk a year and a half later. So I'm now on the business desk. We cover sports related topics through a business lens. So still trying to figure out a little bit what that role is like. But was a biochemistry major actually until I fell in love with journalism at the Collegian. So really hold dear my experience at the James Building, which I know is no longer there, sadly, but a lot of great memories, putting out a newspaper together with Chris and Dustin for part of my time there until they graduated, and just feeling just the really inspired by coming together with your coworkers to deliver something to, or with your fellow students, I should say, to deliver something to your fellow classmates on the Penn State campus is just a really special feeling. So I'm glad that you all are having that experience as well.
Great. Thank you. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to the students. So Amy, I would say, would you like to kind of moderate the questions, or is there somebody on the call that you think you'd like to designate to moderate the questions?
Yeah, I can moderate unless Greg and Zach are on the call. They're our sports editors. I don't know if one of you wants to moderate. If not, I'm fine with it. If one of you is dying to moderate, let me know.
Okay.
No, okay, I can moderate. Yeah, that works.
Okay, cool.
So yeah, I guess I can start off with Greg and Zach if nobody else has any questions. I don't see any hands up.
Last question. Uh, Hi guys, I'm Greg. Thank you for joining us today. What would you say was your biggest experience or your turning point that kind of made you realize that you wanted to do this for a career?
Are we going alphabetically?
Yeah, I still
Yeah,
need
and
somebody.
whatever
Let me
order. I
go in
probably
the
should have
same
been more
order.
specific, but
Yeah. I guess I'll start. I mean, I wanted to do this since I was like real little. I mean, I think I was like probably 7 or 8. I remember watching like Peter Gammons on Center, and he would go on and just he had like this Diamond Notes segment. He would just go on and talk about who should trade for who and everything. Basically, like just go over just his view of sort of the baseball landscape at that time. And I remember watching that and thinking, oh my God, that's a job. I mean, how God, that sounds amazing. And so from there, I mean, I wanted to do that like tried to do everything that I could all the way up. I mean, I was, worked for my junior high paper. I was sports editor of my high school paper. And so when we got to Penn State, it was like, I mean, again, like Corbin and I both basically had we already had professional clips and everything like that, and we sort of that was really cool because both of us were pretty experienced and we started working together pretty early in the process, and having a sense of all right, like I already had an idea of what I was doing, and that obviously sort of helped at the Collegian, but that gave me a better idea of where I could go with it, basically, and be around a whole lot of other people who also wanted to do it. So you got a better sense of what the system would actually be like. But I stumbled into a job before it was my junior year, between my junior and senior year in high school. Uh, there was like these local weeklies in the Western Pennsylvania, like Westmoreland County area. And basically they just needed somebody to, and basically like one sports editor wrote like the whole section and it was a weekly. And the local one had their guy just leave. He was a guy I went to high school with and actually still works professionally in the business, but he just quit the job. I had given them clips at a career fair and they called me up and asked me if I wanted it, and they didn't know I was 17. So I was there for 3 weeks before I realized they figured out that they had to adhere to child labor laws for me. And so, but that was the sort of stuff I try to do everything. I mean, so they stuck it out with me the rest of the summer, but I, came back and did all kinds of freelancing and everything for them. And so, at every step, I just tried to stay involved in it. And, just was always pretty much what I wanted to do.
Okay, I guess I'm next. I actually always wanted to be an artist. I was also an art major at Penn State. But I guess when I was maybe in middle school, I was just like watching the Steelers. Don't put that out there. That's off the record. Being a Ravens reporter. But I was watching the Steelers and there was like a sideline reporter and I was like, oh, I can do that. But I didn't really know what that was. And my parents were kind of asking around. They found out my high school had a student newspaper. And that like I could take journalism. So I started taking journalism and quickly learned I did not want to be on TV. I don't like being on camera, but I love writing. And so I just like our student newspaper took itself as seriously as the Collegian does, even though we were in high school. And so we would talk to like Sun reporters and stuff. And my team went to states that year, and then my prom date went to a different high school, and his team went to states that year. So I was like covering all the like local county teams in the state championship. And through that, I met a bunch of like high school reporters for the Sun and the Washington Post, and just kind of kept going from there. I like had this whole idea I wanted to be editor-in-chief of the Collegian, and like came in, and then I was like, I just love writing. Like I never wanted to be an editor. I was asked a few times if I would apply, and I said heck no, because all I want to do is write, and that's pretty much just kind of went from there. So it kind of started from like this weird little like, oh, I could do that. And then somehow just got lucky enough to have fallen on something I'm very passionate about. Still have the art stuff, incorporate it if I can, but there's just something about like telling stories that just works for me. It's like what I like to do. Um, and so now the journalism like environment and space looks very different from what I wanted to do, but I was very passionate and gung-ho about it from high school on, and the idea of telling stories using sports as the platform for important stories.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I was a science major, biochemistry and molecular biology. So I had planned to, get my PhD and become a scientist like my older sister. Both my parents are engineers. And I just started writing for the Collegian for fun. I thought it would be, I always loved writing. I thought it would be a great, activity to sort of balance out all the science classes. And I think along the way, I just really fell in love with it. It was just like the experience of finding out things that nobody else knows and sharing them with your community, I found to be really meaningful. I think I was covering the women's volleyball team my sophomore year, and I remember the coach at the time, Russ Rose, was like, "Seems like you like really enjoy like interacting with people and interviewing them, and it's hard to imagine you like having the same experience like at a lab bench." And that was sort of the first time the wheels kind of started turning for me a little bit because I realized that that was true, that I did like being out in our community and talking to people, meeting new people from different backgrounds, learning new things. And it was interesting that like science is kind of helpful in a way. I always think that if you have other majors, it's great and it's totally cool to bring a different perspective. If you have a journalism major, that's great too. But, for me, like it was neat to pull on my science experience in terms of like, hey, you're trying to find out facts, um, you know, acquire corroborating information if you're doing an investigation. And so there's a little bit of the scientific process that I think can apply to journalism. And so, yeah, I think for me, it was two things like I said before, finding out things no one else knows and sharing them. And I think also just all of the new people, places, topics that you end up learning about that you never otherwise would have. You really are constantly like learning new things in journalism. And, things that you might not have ever spent time learning about. And I think that's really continues to be one of my favorite things about it. So then I decided, to go to grad school for journalism. I went to Columbia, and actually Chris had just graduated, and I was looking for a place to live. My parents were relieved that I found an apartment thanks to him in his building, and they were like, "Okay, somebody in New York who's living in your building who's a nice person. Like everything will work out just fine." And then I started from there with an internship as the Star at the Star Ledger. So that was sort of my unusual path, and I think it's great. People have lots of different paths. Some are like Dustin, and they've always wanted to do this. Some sort of find their way into it a little bit later, and I think it's kind of great to have both perspectives.
Awesome. We had a question in the chat from Michaela. What kind of areas have you lived in for this career, and do you believe you could live in any kind of area to pursue this field?
I can go first. We can go in reverse order. I've actually always lived in New York post college. So I lived in State College, like from birth through the end of college. And then I moved to New York, and I've been in New York since. And so I feel like those are two really valuable perspectives growing up in like a rural area. State College is a college town, but it's in the middle of like, as you know, like a very rural area. And I think being a university town was really neat too, pulling people from all over the world. And then New York, completely other end of the spectrum in terms of like the size of the city that you're living in, and um, it was two completely different places that I have fallen in love with. But I think if you want to do this job, I think you need to be willing to go anywhere. And I think even if you don't live that many places, I think, being willing to travel places, to go to new parts of the country or the world that you might not ever have been to not sort of be scared about, going to new places or experiencing new cultures, because I think that's a big part of this job is that like even if you're not familiar with something, sorry, there's the siren, New York City at its finest, outside my window. But I think a big part of being a journalist is being able to write or report on something, even if it's not your lived experience. And so I know also, the industry has been really challenging, and for all of you entering it, it's definitely, I try to be honest about a lot of the challenges. I mean, you heard me say that my desk was disbanded a year and a half after I took a job. A lot of places it's worse. Like local news has been completely gutted, and there aren't as many places, but there are also like outlets that have new and different structures, like the Baltimore Banner, which has like done fantastic and phenomenal work. And sort of, if I remember the origin story correctly, you can correct me, Chris, but like kind of came up out of the Suns, being taken over by bad ownership and wanting to bring something better to the community. And so, I guess all of that kind of comes back to the idea that like journalism plays an important role in all kinds of communities across the US and the world. And you can do fantastic work wherever you are. And, if you have an opportunity to go to a different part of the country, different part of the world, I think that only sort of makes, what you have experienced and what you see and the things that you've learned about the world, it's all for the better.
Yeah, I think I agree with all that. And Jenny kind of touched on that everyone has different experiences. For example, one of my good friends who's a Patriots writer started for the Globe right out of college and has lived in Boston working for the Globe right out of college. Whereas I moved to Alabama. I don't think I ever thought I'd live in Alabama, but when I applied to jobs, there were only 7 openings in the entire country. It was like Idaho, Montana, high schools in Texas, I don't know, a few others. Applied to all of them, obviously. Only got one interview. The interview I got was the Alabama one, and I got the job. So I didn't really have that much of an option, but I up and went. And ironically, that job has been open a few times since I left because it does have like usually have a young person who comes through and moves on. And a lot of kids who have reached out to me, younger reporters, have refused to apply for that job because it's in Alabama. And I mean, you're covering SEC schools for one of the major outlets, and it obviously got me to the Inquirer, which is a pretty big jump into pro sports. So yeah, you can do the job from anywhere, but at the same time, you have to be willing to take the opportunities that come to you because you never know when these opportunities will come. For example, this job with Chris, I mean, it opened. I still wanted to stick in hockey a little bit longer, but one, I love what the Banner was doing, and two, you don't know that the person they would have hired instead of me wouldn't be there for life. Like you don't know you're ever going to get that job to cover an NFL team for your hometown. So you have to take opportunities as they come, and you can't, I hate to say, like you can't be too good for any opportunities when you're first starting out. Eventually you have to learn like what your worth is, but you got to be able to be willing to do scary things or uncomfortable things, whether it's going to Alabama, going to Nebraska, or covering a sport that you don't want to cover, going a little off the beaten path, especially as I think opportunities are shrinking. Sometimes you just got to get the foot in the door. They say it's easier to find a job once you have a job. So, and you can find opportunities for yourself from where you are, but at the same time, I think you just have to like really be willing to try new things. And again, as Jenny said, like it really builds your perspective. So, being in Alabama, yeah, I had like SEC on my resume, but what it did for me was it opened like my worldview to what it's like in Alabama. I grew up in suburban, like DC, Baltimore area, and it's like extremely diverse, extremely open-minded. And I just didn't understand how things that were happening in the country were happening. And I go to Alabama and I understand how people develop certain beliefs. And I also understand how they're not always like bad people. They just might not know things. So that's actually what got me my job at the Inquirer, was that the guy who hired me was saying, I was so impressed that you were able to go as a young minority woman to Alabama and cover those hard topics. And if you can do that, you can cover hockey, which is probably the furthest behind in social issue league. So yeah, I think that's always like my number one piece of advice. And it kind of fits right to your question, is like I've lived a lot of places, not as many places. I've lived in some weird places, and I think that is truly what got me on the path to where I am, is like the willingness to go do something scary.
Yeah, I guess I can fit in all that. Obviously, I've been around a lot. It just so happened that basically everything was a college town to start. Basically, I mean, my first, jumped in covering, I mean, James Madison is Division I. I mean, obviously they're an FBS program now. They weren't an FBS program then, but I was just covering basketball, and they weren't very good at all. And basically, the first two, three teams I covered won less than 10 games each season. But it was, and it was a small, it's not a small college town. It's a big enough college town, but it's still, it definitely felt like, just from a, getting in the profession standpoint, or just getting into real life standpoint, like there's a little bit that you feel like you're kind of Peter Pan for a little while. Especially, I mean, I think it was my first 10 years straight at college towns, and Knoxville is a little bit more of a real city, but that was, I mean, it was all, it all took a lot of, it took some getting used to. It took some getting to, I don't know, I guess, kind of getting used to that mentality, I guess, or trying not to get, I guess, too sucked into the idea of just living in a college town. But Jenny and John's points, I mean, basically, you do have to be able to, you have to just go get what's there. Basically, I mean, I just remember, like, every week, I think Chris and I would print out our clips, and this was back, like, I mean, everybody had an email, but I mean, they still expected you to mail things and go through, and just print out and have just stacks of clip files and print out, cover letters, and just send them to places that, I had never heard of, that I didn't even realize have newspapers. I mean, probably sent out like 100 some applications, my senior year, between internships, and actual jobs. And I think the one I got, it was weird, because I didn't even, the guy emailed me back, and he ended up being my boss for 5 years, but he didn't have a subject line on it. And I was interning at the Patriot News at the time, and I wasn't sure, like, I just happened to check my Penn State email, and he was like, "Hey, do you want to come for a, do you want to come for an interview?" And it's like, if I hadn't clicked on the, on the message, which again did not have a subject line, I just vaguely remembered him being a sports editor, one of the names that I'd written down out of like 50. And, basically that turned into, 5 good years. And he was a really good editor to start with. Basically, he was a guy who tried to bring in, really kind of had a little bit of a fiefdom as a sports editor of the paper he was at, but it was really churning out good, young reporters. He ended up being a really good person for me to work for 5 years. His name was Chris Simmons. And I guess the thing is, I hope that there are still places like that. Because I know that a lot of small papers like that have been so gutted, and have lost so much. I mean, I know the Bloomington Herald Times, where I was at for 5 years, and when I was there, the first time, and we had a full newsroom, and by the time I came back, we had like 5 or 6 people working there, and they'd moved us from, having a whole kind of newsroom in the back of the building, to just working where advertising used to be. Advertising was gone, basically. And we didn't even really turn the lights on, especially like after COVID. I mean, they didn't even, we weren't even allowed to answer the door. And it was such a strange thing. And obviously part of that was because of the pandemic, but a lot of it was what had happened before that. And all the ways, just the corporations that had bought it, from the family that had previously owned it, just the degree to which they, cut the place down, and they've since sold the building. I don't even know where they work out of, in Bloomington now. And again, the Gannett owns it, so it's part of ours, but, I know they don't function the same way. So I mean, I think I think the path is different for any of you guys that are come out. It's going to be different in another 4 years. When I started, it was just, man, any newspaper, any small paper you could get, if you could just get on a high school beat, that gave you a shot. That gave you a chance. If you could get on a college beat, that was even better. At least you'd have an opportunity. You'd have a real sense of what it would be like to be a beat writer going forward. But I don't know what all is there and what isn't. I mean, I think, but you do have to be willing to go someplace that's not comfortable. I mean, I think especially if you're graduating from Penn State, you're going to have a lot of friends that go to New York or Philly or Baltimore or Pittsburgh or Boston or whatever, and they're going to tell you about how all the cool city things they're doing. You probably will be in some place that's not as, fun and happening and exciting, and you just have to make it, fun for yourself. Basically, just create a group of friends or whatever, whoever you're working with the paper, get to know people there. It's probably going to be a smaller community. You're going to have to get used to that. And it becomes, it is a little bit different. You work your way up to finding a place that makes sense for you. And, as you get older and as you move forward, obviously other things are going to determine where you want to be. Part of it is going to be the job, but that's not going to be everything. At a certain point, you're going to have to consider family factors and that kind of thing, depending on how things work for you. Obviously, my wife is in the business as well. She's a reporter and journalist. And so we had to kind of, make decisions that fit for both of us. And we've been really fortunate in that regard to make that work out. And some of those things end up being driving forces for you as you go forward. But you do, again, you have to constantly look at what's out there. And to your point, like, you don't want to think that you're too good for anything. And that's truth, both with the jobs you apply for, but also the assignments you pick up while you're there. I mean, you end up moving on, you end up creating a good reputation for yourself by making sure that you're always putting everything into every story, and you never feel like, oh, well, I've covered the NFL or I've covered major Division I college football, I can't cover this community golf tournament or something like that. Like, if you put it all into everything and take everything seriously at every level, and that's what helps you move up, I think.
Thank you so much. We have another question in the chat specifically for Giana. What has your experience been reporting on a team that you were previously a fan of, and how do you separate being a fan from a reporter?
Oh, I think the problem is I actually reported on a bunch of teams I am the opposite fan of, other than Penn State, because Auburn had to. Well, Auburn, I didn't have any feelings towards until after pandemic when they sent me a bunch of hate mail. And then Flyers, sorry, Chris, I was a Pens fan. And Ravens, I'm actually a Steelers fan. But I actually prefer it that way because I don't know if you all can kind of relate. The saying of like, don't meet your heroes kind of fits with covering your own team. I find that on one hand, I am rooting for the Ravens in that I now know these guys and like some of them are really good guys, and I'm rooting for them as individuals in ways that I don't know the Steelers. Like, I don't really care how Russell Wilson does, but I love Lamar, so I want him to do well. But at the same time, uh you see the bad sides of teams like covering up Zay Flowers' domestic assault and uh their reactions to Justin Tucker, as we're dealing with right now a few hours ago. So if that were the Steelers, I think that would be hard. And don't get me wrong, I still have to work with the Steelers here and there, and so I still have some feelings, but I think it would be hard for me to have like all of my young memories that got me into football in the first place kind of tainted. And on top of that, all my family being like, oh, we love, I don't know, let's say Najee Harris, and me being like, oh, he's actually a terrible guy. So that has been the thing. And like the being a fan of the other team, I just keep it quiet. I scrubbed my Twitter long ago. Luckily, having known I wanted to be a sports reporter forever, I scrubbed it before I went to Philly because Philly hates Pittsburgh. And I had almost nothing. The only thing I had, I looked for all pro Pittsburgh stuff and all anti-Philly stuff, and the only anti-Philly stuff I had was anti-gritty, which I still am anti-gritty. So I left it all and I still tweet anti-gritty stuff. But yeah, so I just like kept that in mind. And I think that's something that like I've noticed with other reporters sometimes is like they stay unbiased for the team that they're covering, but they don't think about it for like other leagues. Like, oh, I'm covering the Flyers. I don't say anything about like I'm a Flyers fan. I don't say anything about other teams who are hockey teams, but then I'll be like, oh, I hate the Red Sox and I hate the Patriots and I hate the Celtics. And it's like, well, by that same math, you hate the Bruins. So just like being really aware of that. It's more about like the perception of your fandom, I think, than your own personal fandom, because I think all of you, if you've gotten enough experience like of being in a press box, you've had to learn like no cheering in the press box. You have to turn it off. You're just like doing what you need to do. You're here for work. And so that has kind of made it easier to divorce from fandom for me. The main thing for me is like the perception of fandom that I've had to watch. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much. Any other questions? Oh, Greg.
Oh, yeah, I got another one. What would you say is like the hardest story you've had to cover in terms of the line of questioning you might have had to ask certain individuals, or like Gianna mentioned, the Zay Flowers or the Justin Tucker stories? Like, what's the most difficult story that you guys have had to navigate? I guess we can start with Dustin and then go in alphabetical order.
I feel like unfortunately all of these answers are going to be basically the same kind of story. And I think we've if John is working on the Zay Flowers stuff and the Justin Tucker stuff, I know the stuff Jenny's done that's been tremendous has been some of the same stuff. And I know I had to cover some an array of sexual assault cases at Tennessee. Interesting enough, my wife and I worked on that together. She was the education reporter at the News Sentinel, and I was just covering the football team. And so, I mean, we had to, we had to ask. We weren't always getting victims on the phone. Sometimes we weren't able. A lot of times we weren't able to do that. We weren't able to pull that off. But we kind of dug into just how they were, not just the individual cases, but basically how they were reported. We kind of tried to dig into just how that worked within, a university system. And I remember just one of the questions I did have to ask, and that I didn't have a problem doing it because I thought he frankly deserved it, was basically the football coach basically came out after there was a Title IX lawsuit basically saying, with all these kind of attorneys came out and said, hey, we think the university is handling this incorrectly. We think they're violating Title IX in this way, shape, or form. And basically they had a whole huge lawsuit. And one of the things that had happened, basically, like one woman accused two football players, of sexual assault, and a third player, she was friends with, and she saw him outside this party wherever it allegedly happened, and he drove her home. And on the way home, she explained to him what happened, and he said, "Well, you have to call the police. Like you have to call the cops." And so this trickled out after the initial arrest, and basically we'd heard this, and I asked the university to tell me, okay, and heard that he wasn't at practice, and so I asked has this guy been at practice? And they kind of put me off, and then said it was for academic reasons that he wasn't at practice. And he showed up, and one day like in the middle of practice, the coach was like, hey, where's Dustin at? Dre Bowles is here, by the way. This guy is here. I'm like, okay, well, this is weird. And then when the lawsuit came out, basically the guy had an affidavit saying that one of the other players had called him out and punched him in the locker room, basically for telling the woman to call the cops. And so, like after the lawsuit came out, basically the football coach kind of called a small press conference before a basketball game to talk about all the things they do right as far as this stuff is concerned. And I just asked, was Dre Bowles assaulted Butch? And he would not look at me in the eye about that one. So, I mean, there was obviously that was probably the most in your face question I had to ask. Obviously, I didn't feel bad about doing it because he sort of, like I said, he did enough things to deserve that. But like all of that, certainly there were some different instances of that. Also back in school, I didn't ask a lot of questions for this, but we had to cover another sexual assault case when we were seniors, Chris and I, and where Phillips was charged with sexual assault, and basically covered his trial. So that sort of stuff, and obviously in sports that ends up being a part of the story entirely too much.
Yeah, actually, the Tucker stuff hasn't been hard for me to ask questions because since it happened after the season, it's all been like through their PR people and their lawyers. Now that might change once I get to the combine, because last year at the combine I had to ask about the Zay Flowers stuff, and it was pretty intimidating, but it wasn't necessarily intimidating because of the situation. It was more intimidating because of where I came from, where basically any question I asked was extremely scary to ask because you never knew if John Tortorella was gonna scream at you or give you the best answer in the world. So I think I have a little bit of PTSD from that, where I like anticipated them like losing their shit on me. But even if they freeze you out, they're at least like relatively professional here, to a certain extent. But yeah, Tortorella, like covering him, like I said, it was every single question. It could be like, what did you learn from this game? And he would just like go off at me for being stupid. And it could be like, why did you have a player boycott Pride Night? And he just goes on a spiel about how it's disgusting if you kneel for the national anthem. Like it was, but then like other times he'd be like, oh, like such a great question. Like So I think just the up and down, the everyday of John Tortorella was the scariest thing I've ever had to do. Because I've done a few like had to cover a few different sexual assault cases and stuff, but um, and those are hard, but they're also I don't know. They often go through like lawyers, as we talked about, and all of that. It's sorry, I'm kind of talking in circles, but yeah, I think just emotionally for me, the hardest things were talking to John Tortorella after any sort of game. And it definitely gave me a little bit of a thick skin, but also a little bit of PTSD from asking hard questions. But yeah, sometimes you gotta be like, it's my job, I have to do it. And for the most part, people get that. Like, if they're media savvy, they get it. But um, yeah, maybe I'll get back to you after the combine and after I ask Eric DeCosta and John Harbaugh about whether they're gonna cut Justin Tucker or not.
Yeah, I think the most difficult conversations I think are, with survivors of sexual abuse or harassment or domestic violence. I think in those conversations, you sort of, you have to do your job and get all the information that you need to be able to publish an account. But you're also very aware of not re-traumatizing the person. And, that can be a difficult balance to strike. And it's come up, as Dustin and Giana said, it comes up a lot in sports. It's sort of part of the job of being a sports writer is, having to cover and take on these difficult issues. Have spent some time there are, really good resources that I always recommend to people. The Dart Center at Columbia has a lot of resources for interviewing people who have experienced trauma of any kind that I think are really helpful. Sort of understanding things like people might not have a linear memory of an event that happened. So instead of asking, what happened next, you can ask, what else happened. Being mindful of the framing of your questions. When I covered the Deshaun Watson cases, I remember that some of the women who had come forward were upset because the league investigator had asked them what they were wearing in the massage appointments. And I think, the investigator's explanation for that was, he uh, had asked some of the women to wear something specific. Um, that was part of his request in setting up the appointment, and that, they wanted to assess if he had done that with everybody. But I think you have to sort of also be conscious of how loaded of a question that is. And, if you do need to ask it for a certain reason, such as, did he ask you to wear something to the appointment? Context and framing of the question can be really important so that it doesn't imply some kind of judgment or that, what you were wearing, you know, was a factor in what he did to you. So I think, you know, I don't know that those conversations honestly get any easier. I always do a lot of like over preparation when I know I'm talking to someone who has experienced a form of trauma, because it's better to be prepared and to sort of think out how you might approach difficult questions that you need to ask. Um, there are sometimes like surprises that you have. I mean, I had a story this spring that we were working on a famous mountaineer, Nirmal Purja. And there was a woman who pulled out of the story pretty late after we had gone to him for comment because she just got scared and overwhelmed. We actually didn't ever get a great explanation for why she didn't want to be part of it anymore, other than the fact that like it just kind of became too much for her. And so, that was an experience that I hadn't exactly navigated before in terms of like somebody wanting to not be part of the story like after that late in the process. And so I think the best you can do is over prepare, you know consult resources that might give you ideas of how to frame questions or how to approach things. try to be really transparent and say, one thing that I always say is like, if you move forward and we're able to use your account, we need to put forth the strongest possible public account. So I'm going to be asking you for corroboration. I'm going to be asking you for people you told at the time. And it doesn't mean that I don't believe you, but those are things that we need to have in order to publish this. And ultimately, publishing the strongest public account is better for you and better for me. So different tools like that can be helpful. But yeah, I think those conversations can be really hard. And I also think, part of it is like not thinking that that's going to be easy or going into it carelessly. Like, I think it's sort of good to sort of go in knowing that like, this is a person who's experienced something really difficult and awful, and you have a job to do, and you need to get the information, but you also need to be a human being too.
Does anyone else have questions?
I mean, I can ask another if no one else has any questions. Um, what does like a typical game day look for you guys in terms of like when you get to the stadium, what you're typically writing, the research that goes into a typical game day? Like, what does that look like for each of you? I guess we can go in reverse order.
Sure. I don't really cover games anymore, but I did for a very long time. I was a beat writer for the Jets and the Giants, and then covered the NFL when I was at Sports Illustrated. I mean, I'm one of those people who would always get to the stadium really early. In the NFL, you have to be there when they announce the inactives, but like I would be there much before that, like 3 hours early. I don't know. You just never know what you're going to see at the stadium. Sometimes you can stand in the tunnel and, try to catch a source, or maybe there's somebody, a coach in town from the other team you want to connect with. Um, I also would like to have a lot of pre-writing done, depending on the circumstance. But I think that is honestly like a lot of times the trick to deadline writing, at least for me. I'm like, I can write on deadline and have a lot of experience writing on deadline, but I'm also generally like a slower writer. So it helps me to do a lot of pre-writing, just paragraphs that you can like background paragraphs. You may not even use most of it. Most times you don't, but things that you can move around, reporting you've done during the week. Of course, if you're on a night deadline, writing during the game and all of that. But I think pre-writing is really, and pre-reporting is really, something that I learned over the years was just like a really essential part of the process to feeling prepared on game day. I think always trying to get something a little bit different. So that might be a piece of reporting that you had from during the week leading up to the game that you think might be useful. I remember there was like a Jets game I covered one time, and I had sort of caught wind that there was this big player meeting ahead of time. Like things were really going awry. And I had sort of learned about it the morning of the game, but I did some reporting with sources I had on the team to get some information so that when I went into the locker room after the game, I knew what questions to ask to sort of put together the story. And so they ended up winning. And so, you can kind of tell the tale of like they had this kind of big moment where they were just like, we need to come together. We need to rally around whatever it was at the time. And so sort of being able to tell the reader a story that's a little bit different than, I mean, because nowadays, game stories, everyone's watching the game live, everyone's following along on Twitter. They're probably even watching post-game press conferences on Twitter. So the goal, I think, should be like, going into a post-game interview or game day to try to get something different, something that distinguishes your coverage, something that gives people a reason to come seek out what you write. And yeah, I think that's sort of I mean, I guess sometimes you end up staying. I would always be like kind of one of the last ones in the press conference or press box because there was just sort of a lot to get ready for the next day, or making sure you're writing sidebars or notebooks or stuff that might publish in the morning. I mean, really, the reality is things have changed a lot since I was like first a beat writer when you were like filing on deadline for a paper newspaper. The newspaper where I first started just stopped publishing its print edition like a couple weeks ago, the Star Ledger. So everything is very different. And I think there's a lot more continuous like stories that can go up at any time of day. You're probably writing a blog post for the next morning. So things have really changed a lot. But I do think the fundamental idea of like trying to come out of a game with something different is, that will always be a good guiding principle to have.
Yeah, it's very different for me because the banner doesn't have print deadlines. So I actually do all my writing after the game, after press conferences. My beat partner, Jonas, is maybe a little bit more like Jenny. In his workflow, I am, and Chris knows this, so this isn't exposing anything. I get there and I essentially socialize until kickoff, because I feel like that's where I get my best work is like talking to other beat writers, talking to other like front offices. So I don't know, for the Steelers playoff game, I sat and talked to all the Steelers beat writers and learned that like a bunch of these players had the flu, which became very evident. And then after the game, when I was talking to some of the Ravens, they were like, yeah, like they look like they wouldn't be anywhere but here. But that gave some like context. Or I don't know, at Dallas, I met with like one of the GMs I know. And so I just like talk, and you never know who's going to be helpful down the road to you. So that's my thing. And then I'll prep some stuff. We'll do the inactives, as Jenny said. We'll watch the game. And it's great now. You don't really have to, you can take notes if you want, but the NFL takes notes on everything for you. So I have all my little stat like websites up, and I have my publishing system up. So if someone gets hurt during the game, we'll do like a quick out on that. Um, or I don't know, Derrick Henry hits a milestone, we'll get something up on that. We usually pre-write those, like Jenny talked about. And then once we get to like third, fourth quarter, we start talking what are the main storylines. We'll assign some things, and then we go down to the locker room and press conferences. So my beat partner always goes to the press conference. I always go to the locker room because anything in locker room before the cameras get there is exclusive to you. And so then I work the locker room with what we talked about in mind. If something else comes out, something else comes out, and then I write after. So that's like my NFL game day. I'll give you a quick rundown on my hockey one because I feel like everyone else has football. So hockey looks very different. It's 82 games versus 17. We would go in for morning skate at 10 a.m., do our morning skate. We'd always do a quick pregame notebook. And I had to be a partner for that. And that idea that was for the Inquirer, which is a paper. So that would be with the idea that it could hold over if we didn't finish the game by deadline. So it wouldn't be anything super time specific. It would usually be like, this guy is like focusing on this, or like a bigger picture thing. Used to get to those games 2 hours before, but started getting there an hour and a half before because there's just too many games. And then would eat, would also socialize, especially because their players who aren't playing are in the press box. So that was always good. Hockey games are a lot faster, but what we would do is we had like an instant analysis where we'd have 3 different headlines. And so if it's a close game, we would always do one good, one bad, and then save the third. If they win, do a good takeout, and then if they lose, do a bad one. So that helped us hit deadline, because our deadline was 5 minutes after the game ends for the Inquirer. And so then we'd do that. We'd pack up for that one and go down to press conference. And for hockey, you request 3 people and they bring those 3 people out. So you're not like working the locker room. And then you would just shovel in some quotes, because we also had like a print word count, which we don't at the banner at all. And so we would throw in as many quotes as we could to fit into word count, maybe trim some other stuff, and then we were in and out. It was a lot. It was a 2-part thing, which is interesting compared to football because you have to go in the morning and then you go in at night. But it's a lot quicker of a day because there are so many more days. So that's kind of a little different perspective from our football experiences.
Yeah, my answer has changed so much on this from year to year, from sport to sport, from everything. Because every major sport that you cover has a different rhythm as far as what's available before a game, what isn't, whether you have open locker room, whether you don't in pregame, whether you have it in postgame, all that stuff looks like. I mean, and the, I think to Jenny's point, the print thing, the fact that we have deprioritized print to such an extent is crazy considering what it used to be. Because I mean, you had that time in your mind that you've got to get this to somebody by 11 o'clock, or if not, it doesn't make the paper or it holds the paper up. And it's been weird not having that. In some ways, it's freeing. In some ways, it's the opposite because you have to, on one hand, you don't have to worry about getting something to somebody within an hour or 2 hours of the game being over. But now you have, like, technically you have all night, like you're not released from it until you've written a good enough story that they can use. And so, if it's not going up at night, there's almost a higher bar for it, in the morning, basically, because it's okay. It's not only got to be worth reading, an hour after the game, it's got to be worth reading the next day because you've watched it, you've ingested it, you've looked at the stats, you've probably read the basic stories. So if you're going to waste your, if you're going to spend any time reading something, there's got to be some real depth there. And I don't do a lot of pre-writing, but to Jenny's point, like you're just, I mean, you're constantly reporting and you're constantly looking for angles. And so you're trying to get these, just little piece of information here, little piece of information there. You don't kind of know what's going to all come together with it. So, you're always asking questions that don't necessarily directly lead to a story, that day, because it might be, the story, the following game. Basically, you might ask something on a Tuesday and not print it, especially for basketball when it's games basically every other day. You might not have that in any kind of advance or any kind of like broader story, but you just ask it, and then maybe the next time you asked about this player and he goes off, and you can use that quote or that line of questioning, in your next story. So you're constantly kind of keeping this stuff together, keeping everything recorded, and in some ways, just knowing what you have to go back to. You might have to go to 3 recordings ago to find out, okay, well, what did he say about this? And wouldn't this be a good thing for that? So you keep it on that. For as far as like game day itself, and NBA in general. So if it's a 7 o'clock tip, basically the home team press conference for the coaches an hour and 45 minutes before. Road team is an hour and a half. So I tend to get there 2 hours before tip. So I've got about 10-15 minutes just to get myself settled. All day, basically the injury report refreshes every hour. So, I mean, like, you don't have to look at it every hour. They don't always, put stuff on there, but you do have to kind of check, the injury report throughout the day just to make sure that no one gets added to it, basically. We generally try to make sure we print anything when something happens. Basically, if someone gets added to the report, if somebody gets downgraded or whatever, if somebody goes from questionable to out or out to questionable or something like that, we tend to write about it. So we kind of keep our eyes on that and make sure that when you go into the pregame press conference, you have a sense of who you're asking about, whether they're in, out, or, game time decision or stuff like that. Right off of any news that comes out of pregame, you don't know if there's going to be anything. So maybe, I don't know, 50% of the time I write something off of pregame. And you go in for that, you want to have some sense of something you can ask the other team, even though you're probably not going to use it. Maybe you get an angle that comes out of that. And they do have pregame locker room open for about a half an hour from about, if it's a 7 o'clock tip, it'll be from about 5:45 to 6:15. And a lot of times don't ask anything, honestly. And it's weird because, I mean, when I was covering college ball, it's like we would have just, like we steamrolled people to get any kind of, like, if we ever got open locker room access, like, okay, you have to take all the possible advantage that you really don't get it until the NCAA tournament. And when you do, it's like, man, every story you've been waiting to do, like, try to get it out of that, because you're never going to have this much opportunity to talk to people when, like, just openly, like normal people, because everything, especially with covering IU, is all, press conferences, all very buttoned up, all with a, SID sitting right there to, make sure they didn't get too, personable. And it's weird to have it every day at the NBA and not think you have to use it. But it's still valuable to show up. I mean, it's still valuable when they know you're there and they get used to you. Basically, I'm fortunate to be in kind of a smaller market, covering the Pacers. It's really me and one other guy, covering the team. I'm really, he only travels to a couple games a year, and basically I travel to most of them. Obviously, we've had a travel cut. Everybody's had a travel cut. But it's like if you keep showing up, they know who you are. They get used to it. They know what questions you're going to ask. They have a sense of where you're going to go with things. They're more comfortable. So if they keep seeing you there, it helps. I mean, and every once in a while they'll drag you into some kind of conversation about, like something going on in the league or something they saw watching college basketball or college football or or the NFL or whatever, and just, get into conversations and stuff like that. So anything you can do just to be around and, have them just get used to you as just being a normal person is helpful. And obviously if you're working on, further reaching stuff, deep features or something like that, you can always get somebody for a couple minutes here, a couple minutes there. And most of the time, not everybody is going to be there because they'll have their shoot arounds and stuff like that. But it's still just helpful to be a part of it. And then when that's done, you eat something and you again write whatever you have to write. If there's an injury update, if there's some other news story that comes out of pregame, you have that to write. And then 7 o'clock you get going. And we've even just changed what we've done, during games. And we were live blocking them up until like 2 weeks ago that I would write something at every timeout. Basically, I'd write like 2 paragraphs. This happened, this happened, this happened, and I put a topper on that at the end of the game, and that would be sort of the game story that would hold until kind of my next feature in the morning. Go shoot video, upload all that stuff, create a playlist out of that and everything, and kind of put all those elements together and then write something. But it's all different. It used to be try to get something done a half hour after tip. Or after a game ends. I mean, it is constantly changed. I'm sure it will change going forward. I mean, I think to Jenny's point, you always want to make sure that there is depth, that you have stuff that other people don't have, and most of that comes from just being the person who always shows up, who is always there, who's there for as many things as you can get to, so that you're really following these storylines and see how kind of every game plays in. I always thought you want to make your game stories read like chapters in a book, like they're connected, one after another, and you're hitting on this element and that element, and then there's something worth following. And obviously you don't want to just throw in play-by-play and stats and stuff like that. You want there to be narratives, you want things to follow along, that you're going from piece to piece, and if people feel like they're that everything is part of kind of a grander whole, and that your basically your season coverage is like a book to itself.
I don't know if anybody has any questions. Feel free to put them in the chat, but it looks like we are kind of getting towards the end here. If no one else has any questions, thank you guys for joining us. This is really really neat, really helpful to hear your experiences. Yeah, thank you all. I appreciate it, and we all appreciate you coming on and teaching us a few things.
It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting us. This was really fun.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Anytime, guys. Great.
Thank
Good
you,
luck.
guys.
You so much. Have a good night.